All right. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all having a wonderful experience here at the conference, and I've had some great discussions and conversations and participation at across this whole week. This session that we're going to be hearing from today is called Seeing the Unseen, not through our X-ray vision goggles, but through water, data compilation, synthesis, and visualization. So my name is Jordan Smoke. I'm the Senior Director for World Vision WASH team, and we have a great presentation for you all today. All right, we got more people coming, I think. All right, we'll just keep going. All right. We've got a great presentation for you today. I think we all have, we're all in this discussion about ensuring access to clean water and sanitation for all, right? We're all oftentimes in many discussions, conversations, looking at how are we achieving SDG 6? I think we all love JMP and the information that we're able to get from JMP and looking at kind of global country level rates, global rates towards progress towards SDG 6. We all know there's a long way to go. There's acceleration that's needed there. But I think often as well, what we all like to ask ourselves is how are things happening at a more granular level? How are things looking, in a district by district case or even community by community across the country? How do we know what type of progress is really happening, what the current situation is, where we're investing our funds, or how do we know where to better invest our funds or even validation that the funds that are being invested are having the effect, the impact, the coverage that we all expect to see. And so that's what today's session is going to look at. We're going to hear from Alan Hollenbach and hear from Rachel Pellets from Alan is from World Vision and Rachel is from Acquia. They'll each be giving about a 10-15-minute presentations, and then we'll hear from a panel as well. Rachel will be leading the panel. try to open it up for more participation, discussion than just kind of one-on-one questioning here. So please be thinking of your questions in advance so you can ask both to Alan, Rachel, and the panel that we have. So we aim to wow and amaze here today, and make sure that when you leave here, you're feeling like, wow, that was unbelievable. So with the pressure now on, I will turn it over to my colleague, Alan.
I will turn it over to Rachel. Wow. Okay. Aim to wow and amaze. All right. Thank you for that introduction, Jordan, I think. So as Jordan said, my name is Alan Hollenbach, and I'm a technical director with World Vision US. And in that capacity, it's my privilege to support our country offices around the world, specifically in how they use data to improve our programming, how they use visualizations to track and monitor our programming, all towards the effort of achieving SDG 6. So as I mentioned, the title of the presentation then is Achieving 6.1, SDG 6.1, the role of geospatial data in monitoring progress towards water for all. Now, I love the opportunity to talk about World Vision's clean water programs. Love it. Perhaps the only thing I love more is the opportunity to talk about how we are using data and GIS in World Vision's clean water programs. As my colleagues at World Vision know, probably all too well, I love talking geospatial, geeky geospatial stuff, GIS data, remote sensing, etc. So I hope you have come today willing to geek out a little bit with me and take a look at some fun maps. So let's get started. So in line with SDG 6.1, which is at the top of the screen here, a critical component of World Vision's Global WASH business plan, or our global strategy for the next 5 years, is to support government partners in the acceleration of sustainably achieving universal and equitable access to safe and affordable water for all. Now, this incredibly ambitious SDG target of water and sanitation for all, in my opinion, really requires a deep dive into this concept of the geography of for all. Who are the all? Where do they live? This is the weeds. This is the details, but folks, it is the most important detail question that we can ask at this point. And so to help build awareness of what that geography of water for all means and monitor our progress, World Vision is tapping into the power of geospatial analysis. Yes, geeking out a little bit, enabled by tools and technologies such as digital survey applications, high-resolution satellite imagery, and yes, geographic information systems, or GIS, where we get to overlay fun things like raster and vector data and do all sorts of exciting analysis to help see the unseen and visualize where we are and where we are going. And so for today's session, I'm just going to focus on one example. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll geek out on one example, one country context, and one district and sub-district specifically, focusing on World Vision's work in Rwanda. So in 2018, just as a little bit of background, World Vision embarked on a journey of sorts, an ambitious journey at that, to support the Rwandan government in the realization of universal service coverage in 39 sub-districts across the country of Rwanda. Now, this effort was grounded in a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, at the highest levels of government with the national government, followed by MOUs with 14 respective district governments. And importantly, the programmatic approach that we adopted emphasizes co-investments in all infrastructure and service expansion by World Vision and by the district or national government of Rwanda. So all of the investments that I talked briefly about here today are shared investments in expanded service coverage. Now, a tremendous amount of work went into forging these partnerships. And while this isn't a presentation on systems and institutional strengthening, that's a whole other topic. There was a huge amount of foundational governance support that went into this work, including forging partnerships at every level of government. We see just a couple pictures here of World Vision presidents and World Vision the country director meeting with the mayor, and then signing documents with a provincial governor as well. And the documents were signed all the way up to the highest levels of the government to really get that momentum built. Now, just a few highlights before we move on. To date, we started in 2018. To date, more than 700,000 people have gained access to clean drinking water. 8 sub-districts have realized their coverage goals for clean water, and more than $12 million in co-investments from national and district government partners, Rwandan government partners, has been leveraged as we have worked hand in hand with the governments over these last 4 or 5 years. Now, just a little bit on geographic coverage. We're getting into the maps now. Of course, everyone in the room knows you can't have a good presentation without a map. Take that forward with you as well. Here are the 39 prioritized subdistricts across Rwanda. These colors are broadly signifying coverage levels where we started of low, medium, and high. Here we are today. Actually, about 6 months ago, as of the end of 2021, with nearly all of our sub-districts achieving medium coverage levels and 8 already at their programmatic goals signified by the green. In 2022 and 2023, into the end of next year, they're critical periods. We have quite a few systems that we're working on with the government at the moment. And so we expect almost all of these to turn green by about this time next year. Okay, so let's move on to the fun stuff. With this background in mind, I just want to home in on a single sub-district and talk a little bit about the tensions, about the data, about what we're seeing on the ground. And this is the sub-district of Yanene, and yes, the K's are silent for Yanene. And we're going to explore the geography of water for all within this specific sub-district, which sits inside the district of Gicumbi. Incidentally, in 2017, there was a representative survey of Gicumbi whereby we saw basic drinking water access at about 30% for that district as a whole. So that's a little bit of the context that we started in back in 2017, 2018. So now let's zoom in here for a moment. And here we can see the administrative boundaries of our sub-district, and hopefully you can see some of the major roads as well there. And now I want to bring in my high resolution population data. I love this data set so much that I'm going to do it one more time. There it is. It's beautiful. These look like little gray pixels. They look sort of important, but maybe not all that important, but they are. They're critical. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and give a shout out to my colleagues, one of whom is online at Meta's Data for Good team, for the tremendous work that has gone into this high resolution population density data sets. For those in the room who are not as familiar with this data set, a 30-second intro. The Data for Good team partnered with Columbia University's Center for International Earth Science Information Network, also known as CSIN at Columbia University, to create really detailed population estimates globally on a 30 by 30 meter cell basis across a global grid. So specifically, the Data for Good and CSIN team, they used high resolution satellite imagery essentially, and they partnered this with machine learning to detect and quantify building footprints. across the landscapes. And then they worked with the good folks at CSUN to take population data and lay it across this mosaic of buildings, of settlements, of communities, to home in on estimates of about how many people lived in every 30 by 30 meter block. So I wanted to pause here just for a moment because this data really drives, helps to drive a lot of the analysis that we're talking about here today. This is again on a 30 by 30 meter resolution. I've heard rumors from the data for good folks that they might get down to a 10 by 10 meter resolution at some point. I can't sleep at night when I think about that excitement. But at any rate, you know, it could be coming. No pressure, data for good. So now that we have a little bit of understanding of the base map that I've shown here, I just want to go and look at a little bit of the progress in the service expansion over the last 4 years. So in 2018, we did a baseline with the government of all active water points across the sub-district. You see those in black right at the moment. In 2019, based on the baseline and planning that went into planning for investment and new services with the government, we began expanding services on a co-investment basis. Our first systems came online with the Kenesha water system. Then in 2020, we had 2 brand new systems come online, as well as the system expansion of one of the existing systems. And then more recently in 2021, the Museke system expansion also then came online. I should note for those that are not familiar with the Rwandan context, almost all of these are small scale piped water systems. They are based on gravity fed springs. So almost all of these, when I say systems, they may have 20, 30 different water points connected to each system, depending on the location of the spring. And so now we have our water points here. And I want to dig in a little bit more and begin to analyze the geography of water for all here. So what I'm adding now is a 500 meter radius around each water point that we have within the subdistrict. Why 500 meters? Well, the government of Rwanda mandates that, or their policy, I should say, is that every rural household should be no more than 500 meters from its rural water service point, or its point of collection. The 500 meters is also a very good proxy in my own estimation for the 30-minute collection time for JMP basic. I will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Now, what we can do with this, with the combination of these pixels as well as the 500 meter radius for each, is that we can calculate, based on the gray population pixels, how many people are within this 500 meter radius across the entire sub-district as of today. And what we find is that 92% of the population, when I crank the statistics in the background, are living within that 500 meter parameters. This amounts to just about 21,000 people living within 500 meters. Now, there's a red area up there in which I'm highlighting a possible area that is unserved or was underserved. And so you can see how when we overlay the water points, overlay the buffers, we can start to get a better feeling of where the gaps are. Mind the gap, right? I will say, just as a side note, that just in the last few months, we're now adding 4 more water points up in that red area as well. There is, however, a little bit more. So again, 92% coverage, so to speak, 21,000 people. So we're feeling very good, optimistic about this particular sub-district. There is a little bit more to the data story here. And to see what I mean, I want to take you on just a 30-second rapid tour, no visa required, to the context. And we're going to start off at about 100,000 feet. And we're just going to fly in for a moment and look at 3 water points. And what you'll notice all of a sudden, right about here, is the beautiful topography of Rwanda. The rolling hills will show us two or three different water points here. But notice that that topography, the steepness of the slopes, the road networks. We have some forested areas as well. This is actually really important because it complicates our 500-meter buffers just a little bit, because there's a lot more happening here than just straight line distance that needs to be calculated. And so in the final few minutes, what I want to do is just up the game a little bit in the spirit of our JMP 30-minute collection period for basic drinking water. And I want to build a more rigorous algorithm, a more rigorous model that helps us unpack the geography of water for all. Specifically, this model will incorporate, of course, the water points. That's going to serve as our starting point for walking time, for how far we can get by walking on average from a water point. But then we're going to bring in that elevation that you just saw is so critical in many contexts. But when you're talking about the land of 1,000 hills in Rwanda, it's especially critical. I'm going to also bring in land cover, looking at built up areas, agricultural areas, forested areas. Why? Because it's a lot harder to walk through a forest than it is to walk through a field or down a path. And in regard to that, the last one I'm going to bring in is my roads and pathways. And together we can build a spatial model that pushes things a little bit beyond our simple buffers. And we can develop a walking time model. And what this model shows us is that it centers around those water points. And so the green areas are 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4-ish minutes walking from that water point out into the community, towards the homes, towards where people are living. When we get into the yellow areas, we're getting into 6, 7, 8 minutes. When we get into the orange and red, we're hitting the 12 minutes. Now, why did I choose 12 minutes? A little bit of math. The last time I checked, 12 times 2 walking there and back is still 24-ish. We're going to add 5 or 6 minutes at a water point because you need collection time as well. Again, just a rough estimate. But all that to say that this starts to get us a little bit more towards that 30 minutes. Are we getting within basic drinking water services, which is really our goal here? And because we really want to understand too, where are we at risk from overly long collection times? Where are we at risk still from overly long, overly protracted collection times? In that regard, case in point, I ran the same similar type of analysis, but this time we based it on the walking time, not the 500-meter buffers. And what did we find? We found now that that 92% actually dropped closer to 80%. Is this perfect? Absolutely not. Is it better? Yes. And we're always looking at the better here in terms of spatial analysis, in terms of understanding the geography of water for all. So suddenly we're down to 81% within approximately a 12-minute walk. This is a graphic that I just wanted to show very briefly. I did this model, while you only see the 12 minutes here, I did the model for the entire sub-district. And what you can see here is we want people to be in this, we want people living in this blue zone, where they're within the 12 minutes. Now, what this graph also shows to me is when you're walking away from these water points, you get to a lot of people really quickly, right? Because you see the steepness of that line. But as we move farther away, this line starts to level off. As we get towards the last mile, the last 2%, the last 5%, it becomes increasingly harder incrementally to leave no one behind. And that is a critical point that comes to mind when you start to look at maps like this. The farthest household or population location from this 41 minutes away. Are we going to invest to get to that 41 minutes as well? This is a good question, one that I would open to the room to discuss. Now, interestingly, we did conduct a rapid survey a couple months ago of households, because at the end of the day, you got to do your household survey in the sub-district. And interestingly, we estimated basic service coverage at about 80%. Now, 100% of our 140 respondents had access to an improved drinking water service point. It was a protected point, an improved point of service, which is far and away a huge achievement within this area. We lost about 20% or 29 households to limited. Why? Because of protracted collection times, longer walking times and longer wait times than expected. Just to unpack 4 of those, these are 4 of the 29 households that answered in their survey that they were beyond the collection time, the 30-minute collection time. And you can start to see how they were in our simplified radius, but then they dropped because I believe because they were simply too far from those water collection points. Again, the progress here has been remarkable over the last 5 years, but we see some of the inherent challenges with this particular visualization. Finally, I do get asked quite a bit about wait times and whether that can be modeled as well. It's a little bit more challenging, but you can estimate population served per water point at least to help identify potential overcrowding risk. You see the water points in red, the big red bubble, those are ones serving more than an estimated 575, 600, 700, some of them even at 800 people, where we would think we should probably take a closer look at potential overcrowding risk. So in conclusion then, the facilitation of universal service coverage really requires a comprehensive understanding of the geography of water for all. And folks, when you get into that geography of water for all, which is where I tend to live most of my days, it's complex. And I hope you've started to see just a little bit of that complexity coming through. But the good news is that some of these digital data collection tools, high resolution population, GIS, they can really help us out. Are they perfect? No, but they can help us to map the unmapped. They can help us see the unseen. A few challenges that I'll throw out for discussion later: measuring and validating data collection time per the JMP requirement is complicated. It gets messy. Data sets will sometimes conflict. We'll sometimes get conflicts. In fact, I should say almost always will conflict. In fact, if they're perfectly harmonious, you're probably doing something wrong. That's been my experience. How do we reconcile those? And finally, the difficulty of leaving no one behind comes into sharp focus, I think, when we visualize coverage on a map like this. Nonetheless, in my own opinion, geospatial tools will continue to be absolutely fundamental to charting that path to 2030, to charting that path to universal service coverage. Thank you so much.
Wow, Alan, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot. Before I begin, I just want to ask, I think we might have at least one seat here in the front if anyone wants to not stand for the whole time. Great, so thanks so much. That was really amazing. And thanks for walking us through that great visualization. And I love the tour. So today I'm Rachel Pellitz. I'm the executive director of the Quiet Institute. And today I'm going to talk about doing more with data, leveraging public data for smarter WASH programming. And I'm going to start, and then my colleague Vanessa is going to continue. So I like to start with this picture. This is actually a photo that I took in Zambia, working with one of the water utilities. And literally a lot of the data is left on the shelf. We were trying to understand what was going on in terms of water quality testing, how much they were doing, and basically they pointed us here. And this was where their water quality data was. This was a few years ago, more data is being digitized, but data is still not accessible for decision makers. And what does this mean? That service providers and implementers can't always plan as effectively, and funders don't always know how to best allocate their resources. I think we're at a really exciting time in terms of the information age, where we're on the cusp of a data revolution. So here, if we look at kind of where we are in terms of level digitization in different sectors, roughly agriculture is still in early stages, and in the WASH sector, we often look to agriculture as being further ahead. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for growth here in WASH. So today I'm going to take you through one example, and then my colleague Vanessa will do one more about how to use data to answer some very interesting questions. So this is an example from USAID WASH PALS, which the project was looking at answering a very basic question on where does CLTS or community-led total sanitation work best. There was some anecdotal information from different villages, but we really wanted to understand this in more depth. So we first started doing some searching and found very limited results in terms of what was out there, programmatic data and public data. Then we did a lot of deeper diving to find specific data sets. We had a call out to maybe some of you are familiar with this or saw this a few years ago. We were calling out and asking for programs to provide data. We were looking through a whole bunch of different data portals to get different data sets. And this led us to building our own data directory on this and doing our own analysis. And basically what we found is context matters a lot. CLTS works in some places for certain reasons and others for others. Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet where one size fits all and works everywhere. The sectors realize this. Here on the far side of the screen, I have a visual of the Rethinking Rural Sanitation Guidelines. And this is a document that was put together by UNICEF, Plan and WaterAid, looking at segmenting different populations into rural or mixed rural or rural on road or urban, and thinking about what sanitation solutions make sense in those different contexts. And so this is something that complements that work that's ongoing. But I think then we want to know how can we actually access data on context? If we know that CLTS works in certain soil conditions or certain environmental conditions, how do we get that information? And this led us to developing the sanitation planning tool, or what we call SanPlan for short, which provides highly localized contextual spatial data without requiring GIS expertise. And this is for national, regional, and local stakeholders involved in sanitation planning and monitoring. So currently we have 17 countries. This is publicly available. So if you go to sanplan.app, you can play around with it yourself. Hopefully not during this talk, so you can still listen to me. But I'll just walk you through some of the main features. So here, SanPlan enables contextual location targeting. So this is some of the contextual data sets that we have within a 5-kilometer pixel level. On accessibility, we have information on rural typology, as I mentioned earlier, that's in line with the Rethinking Rural Sanitation Guidelines, travel time to city, distance to roadways or towns, looking at WASH indicators. So for example, the population practicing open defecation or relying on unimproved sanitation or unimproved water, socioeconomic factors such as population estimates and educational levels, and health data, such as diarrheal incidents and under 5 mortality and cholera. So we have 5 primary analysis features. So one is contextual analysis, which is the second here, and that's basically what I just talked to you about the contextual data. We also have the rural typology classification, as I mentioned, the Rethinking Rural Sanitation Guidance that classifies urban, rural, mixed, on-road, and remote. Administrative level contextual analysis, looking at different districts or counties. and community situating. So, exactly, there's an opportunity to actually upload data into the system as well and extract data at locations, and then estimated settlement mapping, so where populations actually live. And I do have to say that it's my wonderful colleagues have created all of these maps and done kind of the technical details on this, particularly my colleague Kara Stewart. So this kind of has led us to a few follow-on steps. So as I kind of walked you through, we first did these search results, we dived deeper into data sets, we've created this visualization tool. So, now you're thinking, okay, so what are you doing with this? One immediate next step is Acquia is part of the USAID program in Ghana called EWASH, or Enhancing WASH, which is a $45 million program led by global communities and delivering water and sanitation services in northern Ghana. Acquia is a research and learning partner on that program, and we're able to bring this tool in as we're planning for research and implementation in those areas. And secondly, this has really identified a broader need in the sector for how do we get these publicly available data sets. Actually, I was talking to Brian Banks from USAID, and he said, he has his own list of what data portals to go to. And, it took him years to compile, and, and we've been doing this too. And it's like, why aren't we sharing these things more? And so that's really led us to the development of Project W. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Vanessa, to walk us through that piece. Thanks, Vanessa.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. So hi, my name is Vanessa. I'm the communications officer at the Acquia Institute, and I handle communications and research dissemination. So I will talk to you about Project W. So for any application like the SandPlan tool, we obviously need data, and finding or even knowing what's out there can be incredibly frustrating. You never know if you're scoped the whole internet, if you looked in the right places, make you go a little crazy. So Acquia kind of identified that pain point. And so we established Project W, which is a centralized data directory and analytics platform for WASH, for governments, funders, and implementers. And we're really hoping that this will make the data search easier, faster, and cheaper. So our tagline for Project W at the moment is get all your data in one location. So when you usually have to go to a bunch of different websites, you can just visit Project W. And we have an amazing team in Nairobi that is just combing the internet day to day and finding all the different websites and data sets that are related to WASH, like public health or demographic data. And on the left, you see an illustration of a lot of the larger platforms that are feeding into Project W that we are incorporating, but we're also really looking to find kind of the smaller websites that are not as obvious. So there's hundreds of other data portals that we are also including and organizing in Project W. And to date, I mean, this number is probably already bigger, but last time I checked, we had around 4,500 unique websites on there, or data sets that we're listing on there. So we started the development this spring, and for us, it's really important to kind of organize the data, not just have it available, but to make it easy for you to search. So one of the really components we focus on is categories, and we're working on establishing. We have around 100 different WASH topics that we're kind of putting into a hierarchy and making it user-friendly and kind of intuitive to find what you need. And that's also an ongoing process. So that hierarchy is growing and growing the more data sets enter Project W. And geography, I think, is also a really important one to search by. That's a little bit easier. We don't have to reinvent the wheel there. We're just including the countries. You can also search the website by specific sponsors, data formats, the latest update to a data set, and then access level. So is it freely available? Can you instantly download it? Do you have to register? Do you have to request it? Or even some of them are paid, which is not our focus, but we're including that if we think the resource is still valuable. And then this is an example of a search result. So for on-site sanitation in Kenya, and then you just can kind of see the setup. So the rows show you kind of a brief overview of the data set. And then you can, if you know, this is the one I need, this is the one I want, you can just click on get data and it will bring you to the data. Or you can click on the name and it'll show you a record sheet, which shows a lot more contextual information, like the specific indicators or why the data was collected or the different methods. And so this slide compares Project W to other search platforms, some of them that I mentioned before, and just shows the specific like keywords that we used for different searches. So you can see like the humanitarian data exchange or World Bank water data or the DDL. And in general, it shows that especially for very WASH specific data, there's no platform that really digs that deep, and Project W kind of gets the most hits on this comparison. And then lastly, to bring it kind of back to the theme of the session. So why are we working with these data applications? So data can accelerate SDG development, and it helps target interventions to populations most in need, monitor progress, and also tailor interventions to specific contexts for sustainability. And then some of the challenges that we're still facing, which we're also hoping to bring into the panel discussion, are making that data accessible for decision makers, and then ensuring data quality and also data privacy. So hopefully we can touch on all of those in the panel discussion, and I'll hand it back to Rachel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. Really excited for this session. And we really wanted to make this interactive. And so really for the next half hour, 45 minutes, we're going to be doing a panel discussion. So I would like to invite our panelists to come up. Alan, who is right here, so maybe we could just scooch over, would be great. Veena from Atri, based in India. Sorry, I didn't introduce Alan properly. Alan's from the Kampala Capital City Authority in Uganda. And then we also have Tom Slaymaker from JMP UNICEF. And then we have Carlos, who is joining us online from Berlin on Data for Good at Meta. There he is. Great. So I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves briefly, maybe 3 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up. So please be thinking about your questions. And yeah, I'll start with Veena. How about?
Are we just introducing ourselves or saying something about, we're talking about data, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, just checking. It wasn't going to be a 3-minute long introduction of my CV. So, okay. No, well, that was a really interesting set of 2 conversations. And I thought I wanted to start with the question of when we're talking about water data for who and what. So we had a conference or a workshop a couple of weeks ago in India, and one of the local CSOs described data in this way. He said, data is anti-gravity. It's one of the few things that goes up and doesn't come down. And I thought that was really, really interesting because it really speaks to the question of for who are we collecting this data, who's going to use it, and what's the intentionality behind it. So we've seen a number of really excellent presentations today on these, what I'm going to call large global data sets, which I think is very, very useful from the perspective of how do you prioritize, where do you direct investment, what kind of investment should you make. But it doesn't necessarily isn't designed to necessarily help a local community, a local water service provider, in India's case, a Gram Panchayat or a farmer collective, necessarily make better decisions. And I think ultimately what happens is that if we want data to actually transform the way communities manage their water or water service providers manage their water, you need data that's local and contextual. And you need to build capacity at scale for people to be able to use the data, because forever and ever do we want to have large INGOs basically being the only place where you have capacity to manage data at that level. So I think that if we want to really do what all of us want to do, which is universal access to water and sanitation for all, I think that you really need to be completely changing the way we think about data and basically creating local data that can be used locally, but along with that, the capacity to use the data. Now, what does that look like? And I think I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 things that I didn't hear about today enough. The first is basically asking the end users a little more about what they would like to see in the data and allowing them not just to see the data, but play with the data. So one of the things we've been doing at CSEI is we have a QGIS plugin where what we try to do is to allow some of those data sets to become available so that people can play with the data. They're not just looking with the data at the data. They can add their own local data to it, overlay it, and then make a bunch of much richer decisions than they would be able to make. So basically combine what I would say global data with local data. The second thing is, I think, explicit investments in creating capacity. There's a lot of interesting experiments in India on what is called contextual capacity at scale through digital attestation programs, where hundreds, sometimes thousands of local community resource professionals have been trained to use data, to collect data, and then actually make decisions. And I would say that the third point I would like to say is that that just going digital, speaking to the Zambia case, doesn't automatically solve problems. We have a lot of data in India that is in the public domain, but some of the data is just missing one key parameter that you kind of need to be actually able to use the data. And so I think not just going digital, but actually ensuring that the data is enough. It has all of the fields, all of the parameters that actually communities use, because some of the data is sometimes masked so that it's not available. And so special investments need to be made to make sure that public data is actually public and usable. And then the last piece of it, I think, is this issue of thousands of competing platforms. We see even in the global context as well as in the Indian context, India is a very tech-savvy country with very large amount of investment going into digital, and it feels like almost every large CSO has its own India-wide digital platform. And one of the things that we've struggled with, and we are really trying to push this through what we're calling the Knowledge Commons Initiative, working with a large number of CSOs to say, how do we really promote data interoperability so that we're not trying to create one apex platform, which is the mother of all platforms, but really thinking about many platforms that all have APIs and data interoperability so they can all share data with each other, so that each one is kind of trying to cater to different audiences and different use cases, visualizing and massaging the data in different ways. But at the end of it, it's really, I'd like to think of it as a constellation of data platforms instead of each one of them trying to kind of be the mother of all platforms. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Veena. It's really, really great to get your perspective. And I look forward to diving into more of some of these issues with the audience too in a few minutes about competing platforms, about end users, and some of the other points you brought up. In the interest of time, I'll pass it to Tom Slaymaker to go next from JMP and UNICEF.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for the nice presentations. Some really, powerful data visualization, and I like the sort of ambition of Project W to try and bring more of these data together. I work on the UNICEF side of the JMP. My colleague Rick, who leads the WHO side, is also here, and I think we're responsible for global monitoring. Our primary focus is on the cross-country comparison. So we produce reports for households, schools, healthcare facilities. We produce a lot of charts and tables. And there's a huge amount of work which goes on behind the scenes in order to process all of that data. So the reports that Rachel put up on the shelves, we take those and we turn them into, standardized, comparable data that can then be used to make a meaningful comparison. But I think one of the other things that we're trying to do is to start to provide data services. So we're packaging the data in different ways for different audiences. And some audiences want to have ready-made charts and tables. They have their particular favorite charts. You can start to make some of those on our website, and we also automate a lot of these so that they're already there in a certain types of analysis are ready-made. But a lot of other users want to be able to access more of the data in a form that hasn't already been packaged, and they can then analyze that and use it for their own work in a number of different ways. So that raises some really interesting questions about, what is it that you want to do with the data? What do you want to use the data for? And I think increasingly, given the amount of data out there, it can be quite overwhelming. And I think it's especially overwhelming for some of our national government counterparts who are trying to make sense of all of these different data sets, how they can make use of them, how they can understand which data sets are going to be useful for which purposes, and also to design a data strategy. You need to have a clear strategy around how you're going to collect data, but also how often you're going to collect data, and that will be determined by what it is you actually want to use it for. There's a very different strategy for generating national statistics as there would be for generating data for planning and data for operations, and we need to recognize that. I think there's also very big differences in the value of different types of data collection for these different decision-making processes. So data that's coming from a household has a particular value if you want to understand what households are actually doing. But that's different from data that will come from the system, the water point or whatever, and you want to understand the service. And that's different again from data from service providers, which may or may not be compiled by regulators, and also data from local government, which may or may not match what is coming from the service providers. And so we're trying to draw on all of these data, but we have to pick and choose amongst them, depending on which data source we think is going to be most reliable for generating statistics on different things. And I think that's super important. I mean, this presentation on infrastructure coverage is fantastic. It's an amazing piece of work. You've got all of these people living at the top of the hill in Uganda. Sorry, the water points at the top of the hill and the people are living at the bottom of the hill. So this whole kind of question of distance to source is really important. But of course, infrastructure coverage also, it doesn't ultimately tell you whether people are actually using those water sources. So you still need to go and talk to the household, and you still need to go to talk particularly to marginal and vulnerable groups who may be denied access for different reasons. So we need both types of data. And the things I think we should be getting into in this discussion is then how do you integrate these different types of data? How do you put them together on a map? How do you put them together in a searchable database such as Project Q? And how do you help the user to sort through all of these data so that they understand whether or not they're comparable, which data are reliable and good quality and which ones are not? And frankly, all data are not equal, and we need to remember that.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks to the JMP more broadly too for providing some of the the data that really guides the sector in terms of water and sanitation. So next, I'm going to introduce Alan from Kampala Capital City Authority in Uganda.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, my fellow panelists. Thanks firstly for the opportunity to come here and share. And I think the topic of data is a very topical one right now. And in many ways, Mina and Tom have already hit the big points in terms of the data issues, in terms of the context, in terms of who needs to use the data. So, because that very much frames the kind of data you're collecting. And so what I'll do is just share maybe a bit of context from a local government or a subnational on how this data what some of these data challenges are at the subnational level. Kampala Capital City Authority manages the capital city of Uganda, and some of the really key data, if you like, requirements or interests on how services are being provided within the city. Now, that's very straightforward. If the system is a centralized system, maybe water supply, maybe sewerage systems, that becomes very easy because then you have the points of collection, you have your pipe network that you're monitoring, and the treatment plant. It becomes a bit more complicated when you're talking about the non-centralized systems, when you're talking about the point sources like we saw in the presentation earlier, when you're talking about the non-sewage sanitation and all the various nuances and issues that come associated with that. And so for me, it's just really sharing that the context also gets a bit more complicated when you veer away from centralized systems, because then the data points become very many. And then we're back to the issue Admin was talking about in terms of the various platforms, the various types of data that need to be managed to give you an overall view or perspective of how the service is being delivered at that subnational level. So that is really one of the issues that I'm hoping we shall delve into a bit later. But I'll just finish off and conclude because I came in late, so I'll use 2 minutes. The issue of associated costs that come with the data collection, especially for governments, for subnational governments. The costs associated with data collection are not really understood. They're not really appreciated. And that means little investment goes into the data collection systems, which means then the decision-making gets impaired and so on and so on. And we also see this also when we're dealing with partners, the NGOs and other organizations that are not research-based. So again, the emphasis tends to be more on implementing, and rightly so, because that's what their interest is. But then we miss out on the data aspects that would have been very useful to collect as they carry out that work. So context, data needs, costs associated with data collection. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alan, for bringing up the issue of cost of data collection and also how you gather data on-site sanitation where it's quite dispersed. So next, I would like, actually, I'm just going to take 1 minute and say, I know some people have left, which is fine. I know sometimes things happen. I know how uncomfortable some of these seats are. So if anyone wants to just move, there's a couple of the bar stools that are free, a spot on the sofa. So feel free if anyone's back's hurting. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carlos Ahumada from Meta Data for Good, who's joining us virtually.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes? Wonderful. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, exchanging some ideas on this very important topic. Apologies. I would have loved to be there in person with you today, but I'm attending another conference here in Berlin around data and data innovation, but I am sure that we can exchange some good ideas virtually. So first of all, I would like to quickly thank World Vision, particularly Alan and Elizabeth, for the invitation to participate in this panel, and the Stockholm International Water Institute for organizing this important event. My name is Carlos Ahumada, and I lead Data for Good partnerships in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, based out of London. I am part of the team that builds this high-resolution settlement layer, our population density map, that Alan already explained and mentioned very well, and that we hope we can continue informing research and work around access to water and sanitation projects. This is a tool that is always in development, just as Alan mentioned. We are currently rolling out our 1.5 version of these data sets and maps. This new version contains, for example, radar systems that reduce the propensity of having errors that we obtain through the use of satellite imagery. Because when we use satellite imagery, sometimes we have clouds, that block vision, and we can get some false positives, for example. So it's a tool that is in constant development, and we are really aiming for improving it every time. So very briefly, I'm gonna quickly introduce you to Data for Good at Meta if you're not familiarized with it. That Data for Good at Meta, what we aim to do is empower partners around the world, stakeholders such as government agencies, international organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, academics and researchers, with privacy preserving data sets and tools that can help support their work around key topics such as climate change, sustainability, economic development, of course, access to water, sanitation, etc. Data for Good is a program that was built in 2017, and it started with just one tool and few partners, and with the purpose only to support our partners working on the humanitarian sector, to support their work around crises, natural disasters, etc. But then the program has been evolving organically, and now we have more than 600 partners working in around 80 countries around the world, providing positive social impact in these kind of topics that I already mentioned. The tools that we have mainly can be divided into maps and surveys. We have maps on population density, we have maps on movement, we have also the relative wealth index that measures how relatively wealth or poor is an area of 2.4 square kilometers compared to another area of the same size within each of the 100 low and middle income countries in the world that we produce this data for. And we built this to using traditional and non-traditional data. Traditional data, the surveys on poverty and wealth that USAID developed, and non-traditional data, the data that we collect as company, such as the number of mobile phone devices that we identify in the territory, whether the operating system is iOS or Android, the number of Wi-Fi access points, etc. These tools, the high resolution settlement layer and the relative wealth index, for example, are publicly available to anyone. They are hosted at the United Nations Humanitarian Data Exchange portal and can be accessed immediately. And this is the case for most of our tools. And most of our tools are publicly available and hosted there. Still, we have a small set of data sets and tools that are control access, that are limited to academics, researchers, nonprofits, and international organizations. And these set of tools require a very simple data license agreement for them to use it. And this is because we just want to make sure that our partners use the data with the purpose with which it was created, right? So I hope this brief overview of Data for Good is interesting to you and can spark some conversation between us. And we're always happy to explore new collaboration to continue providing positive social impact around the world. Thank you very much, and happy to exchange some more ideas with you around this important topic.
Great. Thanks so much, Carlos. It's great to hear more about the high density population maps that Meta has, Data for Good at Meta has created, and know that those are all open source and accessible for everyone. So with that, now I have a bunch of questions prepared if needed, but I would really like to open this up to the group and make this a bit more interactive. And as we were sitting here right during this session, Vina wrote me a note, how provocative can I be? And I was like, go for it, so let me just start with that, and Elizabeth's going to help us ask questions around the room. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Tom Dyer from Mantea Group in Belgium. Maybe a question for Alan, others can also jump in, of course. It's a very nice work. 10 years ago, I was working in Washington, Uganda, which is a similar context, and I wish we had the possibilities that you've been describing now. Now, one question I have, do you also use, or have you tried to see if that can be used to further optimize the sites, the location of water sources, which probably would require additional information about suitability, willingness, or other factors. we are at the moment working for organizations such as UNDP, UNESCO, and multi-hazard and risk. One of the applications that we are developing is actually also meant to serve for infrastructure decisions. So how do you see possible integration of that? If you try to find locations, do you also then look at what is the vulnerability of those sites, or what measures should be further taken to that?
Yeah, thanks so much. Absolutely. I mean, we have limited time in this particular session, so I focused on one very concrete case. But in terms of looking at other new potential areas of where we are, possibly going to co-invest with government, yes, we definitely want to incorporate this type of analysis as well. And to the point that was also just brought up by the panel, we're also, it's always mixing bottom up and top down sources, right? This type of data analysis can help. I often say that don't look to the data to provide the answers, look to provide the right questions. And a lot of times it can help when our local team is working with the district governments, the mayor of a locality, to help ask the right questions. Like, we see a potential underserved area here. We think this might be a place for that we can co-invest with the government. What do you think? And this is the data we're seeing. Some of that data may be incorrect, and he or she may quickly correct us, which is absolutely what we're hoping for. But yes, I think that more and more we want to use it to optimize locations as well. One of the real challenges going forward, as everyone in this room knows, is the water resources question. The visibility of groundwater is challenging. Optimizing the locations is challenging, particularly when we start to project outwards and look at what are these water resources going to look like 5, 10, 20 years from now? Are they even going to be there? It's a real question that we have to weigh through. Now, going forward, I'd like to see more and more of that type of vulnerability analysis brought in as well. So any ideas about how, and that's complicated. If there's anything that one theme that I've heard come up as well, and Alan mentioned it so well, it's complex. It's very complex. But yes, absolutely, I want to try to get in more of that holistic perspective, particularly tying the water points, water services to the hydrological boundaries, because that to me is often missing in the maps that I see, is the relationship to the hydrogeology. So yeah, a very good point. Thank you.
I had already. Okay, so I got exactly, that's my point. So what I see completely in your story, I like the story, and I like data accessibility, etc., etc. I'm from Delta, also an open there to share. But what I completely miss is the hydrology part. I'm a hydrogeologist, and what I see from your case is just a roadmap to disaster. It's a roadmap to over-exploitation. You miss completely that part. And you say it's complex. It's complex if you don't bring the knowledge in. You should already from start bring the knowledge in. If you go in that direction you've shown, you start extracting too much. You should directly from scratch bring in those things. And also for the other people, I think the data you share, you have the responsibility to see the effect of data sharing. And it can be a disaster if you do sharing too fast, too many kind of data which are sensitive too. And I miss it in the storyline basically. And also in really giving big data out and showcase that is also in a difficult, in a conflict zone area. That's also very stressful, that you show so much data that can be used in a conflict zone. I think you should also consider that from scratch instead of only afterwards. Can you elaborate on that for a short moment, please?
Sure, I'll just say thanks for being provocative. That's what I asked for. Yeah.
Well, It was a 15, 20-minute presentation, and I couldn't have time to get into every single layer of data. But just wanted to highlight one example of how data can be used in association to the population itself. World Vision has a team of hydrogeologists that works with the community and works with the government to help ensure that we're not on a road to disaster. I did not bring in different hydrogeological layers here for a number of reasons, but I think that that's absolutely a critical point to keep in mind going forward. And essentially, I trust a lot of the analysis that's going on by our Rwandan hydrogeological experts in the field. They are there. They're the ones who know the context best. They're the ones who work with the community. They're the ones that work with the district government as well. So this is just a snapshot. It's not meant to be the entire the entire picture. But one thing that it would be great going forward, and this is on the broader holistic picture, is how to better bring in hydrogeological data, which is very, very challenging. I was really, really encouraged to have a conversation down on the first floor with, I think it was in the Grundfos room, I can't remember, but they had a tool with which they were able to do site assessments of groundwater hydrology that now have previously taken 4 to 8 hours, in which they can do in a third of a second by taking the device that's down there. And I encourage you to go take a look at it throughout an area to get a better idea of the precise hydrogeology, including, and this is critical, including areas of recharge for those aquifers. And so I think that's also a really important point of how can we protect areas of recharge as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alan. I also just want to acknowledge you did bring up data privacy as well, and that's definitely an issue when we're thinking about data. Great, thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdi Wario. I work with Gatsby Africa. My question is directed to Alan and Vena. Where I work, we support water utilities to adopt data management processes in order to make objective decision making and reduce guesswork in terms of making decisions. But one of the challenges we have is moving from the test case to scale and sustainability. So from your experience, how do you move from pilots to scale and sustainability when it comes to adoption of such technology?
So I'm going to just repeat what I said about creating capacity at scale, because one of the reasons I deliberately push the local versus global is if you're creating data sets, but the people that can use them are just a few people sitting at a national level. I think basically any attempts at data needs to be accompanied by capacity building programs to use data. And I think there's just not enough emphasis on the latter. So I don't have much to add to your question other than there needs to be investment in that as well.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think the only thing that I would, and maybe I would invite Alan to respond as well, because he from the local context. But the only thing I agree with the capacity building side, absolutely. And we're working in Zambia right at the moment, and we're using similar technologies, and it's really been a process of iteration. Of building capacities on our team and then building capacities at the local level as well. And I think, one of the greatest challenges, and I'll turn it back and put the spotlight on ourselves, is timelines. So many times that we're looking at these timelines that are just not realistic, and we're saying we got to get this done. And it takes real time to build capacity at that level. So,
thanks, Alan.
I'll just ask. That's all right. What do you mean by scale? And this is to all of us. What do we mean by scale when it comes to data systems? Is it one department using it? Is it two? Is it the whole organization? Is it one community? Is it, how do you mean by scale? That helps to answer your question as well. And as Alan said, helps us to be more realistic in terms of, our ambitions and our roadmaps for the use of data.
Great. Thanks all. I see Tom wants to add in too.
Well, I think this is an interesting discussion, and I think the danger when you see a great presentation like that, where you've done a lot of work and all the data's lined up and it's all working beautifully, is you fall into the trap of thinking it's trivial to just add a few more data sets and overlay them and maybe look at something else. I think when we talk to our country offices, they are trying to develop some basic ways of putting different data sets together, and they want to be able to put together the data on WASH service levels with some information about climate risks. But even that is very challenging. There are technical challenges there to do with linking up data, which is population-based data, with data that is essentially hydrological data. There are a whole number of issues we could talk about there about how you make those data talk to each other, let alone trying to track changes over time. It's not trivial at all. And then you've got the questions of accessing the data and data sharing between the different ministries at a country level. And this is really serious. You need to have a memorandum of understanding in place across ministries, what data will be shared, how it will be used, and that takes time as well. You need MOUs between UN agencies working in the same country to share data. It takes time. But the related issues about ethics and linked to data sharing, there are important considerations. I mean, particularly for UNICEF, we have a whole team working on responsible uses of data related to children, and there are a whole range of different checks that are in place now for the collection of any data that could potentially be linked to an individual child. I think that's super important. But ultimately, this comes back to what is the data going to be used for? Is it going to be taken up and used? I remember I was working on water point mapping in Malawi in 2001. So a lot of the basic technology has been around for a while. We didn't have, Google Maps in those days. We didn't have metadata for good, but the basic functionality was there, and the challenge was the capacity to use that data to make decisions on how to allocate resources at a district level in Malawi, and that capacity wasn't there. And so the system eventually fell apart. And I just think we have to keep that in mind. The design of the data collection and the data compilation and the visualization needs always to be geared to who's going to be using it and what are their needs, and how do we make sure that it's in a form that is usable for them.
If I may add a quick point on that, very quickly, just to build up on that comment, because I think it's very important. So Data for Good at Meta, we don't only consider ourselves as data providers. One of my priorities in this job is to really foster and promote a collaborative ecosystem that works with data within countries. So make sure that academics, researchers, government agencies, international organizations, nonprofits are talking within each other and can fill the gaps in terms of skills, in terms of knowledge, in terms of visibility and angles that they might have when we are talking about development projects. So for me, when it comes to scale, it's not only a responsibility of government and government agencies, but all the actors and stakeholders within countries that are working in these type of development projects. And as I said, this is one of the priorities that we have also in Data for Good at Meta.
Important conversation. My name is Faith Sternlieb. I'm with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in the U.S. We work globally, and I work for the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy of the Lincoln Center, which is specifically that, working on land and water policy in the Colorado River Basin. I was curious though about the population data set, Ellen, that you presented, but probably a question for Carlos. I was curious about how and if this global population data set is different than GHSL. And then I was also curious about if and what and how and when you're planning to do that 10 by 10 resolution population data set. And then thirdly, who's ground truthing the data?
Great, thanks. Over to you, Carlos.
Sorry, can you repeat your last questions because I didn't get it? Sorry.
Sure. The question is about ground truthing the population data set.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start with the 10 by 10 meters resolution. This is something that the team is exploring still. As I mentioned, we are rolling out the version 1.5 of the population and city maps that contain not only satellite imagery, but also radar systems. There are, of course, other improvements in the pipeline. For example, distinguishing between the different types of structures that we identify in the territory, right? If they are residential, if they are commercial. So there are many improvements that are happening at the same time. We do not only develop these tools, we're also developing others. So right now we don't have like an estimated date of releasing these 10 by 10 meters resolution. But of course, we will keep our partners and the community involved up to date when we're ready to launch it. In terms of ground truthing data and how it compares to other data sets, so we have conducted different validations of these data sets. So for example, we have compared its performance with Landscan, with WorldPop, with BMap, etc. And we found out that, of course, different maps have different advantages, right? And ours, for example, performs particularly well when it comes to rural areas. So we are always trying to do this kind of validations with other existing maps when it comes to ground truthing and actually going ourselves and trying to validate our maps in the territory. As you can imagine, that's very costly. And that's something that we unfortunately cannot afford in our program at Data for Good, but we count on our partners to also provide some feedback on the accuracy of the maps that we produce. And I hope I answered your questions with this.
Just one follow-up, Carlos. I was curious about the 30 by 30 resolution data set that Alan showed and how that's different from GHSL.
I will have to come back to you with this answer because I do not know. So happy to follow up with you directly after getting back with my technical teams on this question, if that's okay with you.
And nice to hear about the 10 by 10 data set coming out. I think you don't want to give us a date because we want to make sure Alan can sleep and he's not up waiting for that. So, but great. All right, who's next? Thanks.
My name is Frank Greaves. I work as WASH lead for Tier Fund in the UK. I just really want to absolutely emphasize what's been said about how the data is used and in fact who owns the data. And the fact that the data can lead the system into decisions that are unforeseen. So brilliant to see. It's a fantastic tool, but it might not lead directly to what we think it's going to be, those who designed it. So for example, oh, we need more water points here, or we need to invest here. It could be, as in our experience and in work that we've done, into absolute fundamental changes in structure. For example, the community-based management system in this situation doesn't work. And so the decision around how that data is used is gravitated towards the government, towards the authority. It's a systems approach. And then there's policy and regulation, and the whole direction of the project becomes one that is just sort of unforeseen, and it becomes slower. And I think it's just the fact that we just got to allow for that. If we're creating these data systems, and we're also grasping the systems approach, understanding the role of the ultimate service provider and authority in the government, then it may not be up to us how that design is then iterated and at the contextual level. It's just our experience, but the usership and the ownership is critical.
I'm going to ask Alan to respond to that from Kampala Capital City, because I know in Kampala there's a lot of exciting work going on in terms of fecal sludge management and mapping where the needs are and connecting users and providers. So curious to hear your own experience about using data.
I'm sure we've got all day. It's a very good point you've raised because and I think Tommy alluded to it earlier, that many times the data we collect is trying to answer some questions that we are raising. And these questions will vary from each one of us in this room. We all have different questions to ask depending from the point of view of the organizations we're working with or the kind of objectives that we're trying to hit, and all are varied. So you're very right that many times you can start off from a data systems point of view, and you quickly escalate or go to a system strengthening, which I think at the end of the day, especially for developing country scenarios like ours, is really where you want to go. You want to build the systems that can support the data management, can support the operations, that can support the planning and all those aspects. So I think it's a very good comment to try and link. Sometimes it's not as straightforward. It's especially if the local partners have a different understanding as well. So there's a lot of effort, and back to Alan's comment that it does take time to iterate, get all these conversations aligned and get this system in place. So for Kampala, we've been doing some work over the last couple of years on land sewage sanitation, trying to get the fecal sludge management chain up and running. Again, the data required along each of those stages of the value chain is quite a lot, but it's been useful to try and get that data. We're at the point where we're trying to now have a system, a data management system or ecosystem in place where all partners, be they government, be they NGOs, can all plug into, and such that you get this data being upgraded or updated nearly on a real-time basis. And sometimes the data that you collect can be very interesting. We're doing a small study where, do you all know the sheet flow diagram? Yes, very useful piece of tool, a very useful tool to show where the leakages are within the waste management chain. But then we decided to add some additional data to that to show where is the greatest, because then there all your mapping is the hazard. So we try to add more data to now try and understand where is the greatest risk along that SFD. And funny enough, sometimes it's not where you have the biggest leakage, which is further downstream at the treatment plant or at the pipeline. Now the greatest risk was at the containment at the very beginning of the whole chain. And this is not something that jumps out immediately when you look at the SFD. So you're absolutely right to try and think from a systems point of view. You're absolutely right that the more data you add to it, the more the picture changes. But ultimately, the decision makers, being the users, being the local authorities, will have a role to play, because then they will ask the questions, where should we invest our little or meager resources? And in doing that, then you start to actually generate the data that is useful for. I hope I have not taken all day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. I think in the interest of time, I think we're going to pass it over to Veena to do a quick final remarks for us, because I know we just have maybe a couple more minutes. So thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. I think firstly, very, very interesting set of comments and discussion. World Vision, and I think the initial presentation by World Vision, as was evidenced by the questions asked, very inspiring in terms of what's possible in predicting and prioritizing investments. I thought really useful set of responses in terms of what might be unintended consequences, but couple of the questions that and also unintended consequences was one, but also who are the users of that data and how are they going to use that data, not just at the national level, which is sometimes where these very large scale data visualization efforts go, but really kind of bringing it back down to the end users. Obviously, the remarks that we saw from Tom in terms of GMP, I think that kind of reinforced the idea that there's value in global data sets to the extent that you can see inter-country comparisons. So I think one of the themes that you kind of see is the value in large global data sets to compare across countries, and then what additionally needs to be done to kind of make the data useful within countries at the levels that you need. I'm actually going to stop there in the interest of time, but thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, great. Thanks so much, everyone. I'd especially like to thank World Vision and our panelists and Meta for putting this together, and all of you for being so engaged. And I hope we continue this conversation, because it's, we just have a lot of potential to do more and do things better in the WASH sector as more data is available. So thanks, everyone.